Midnight Signal, Skinwalker Ranch. Deep in the heart of northern Utah lies a stretch of land that has quietly accumulated one of the most extraordinary collections of unexplained events ever documented. UFO sightings, mysterious creatures, cattle disappearances, and forces that seem to defy every law of nature, all concentrated around a single remote property in the Uinta Basin. This is the story of Skinwalker Ranch. Locals in this part of Utah will tell you that something is fundamentally different about this region. Strange lights drift across the night sky. Figures that don't quite look human have been spotted along the roadsides. Even Bigfoot-like creatures have reportedly emerged from the wilderness here. The history of unusual encounters stretches back as far as the earliest human settlements in the area, and surveys suggest that roughly 3 in 4 residents have personally witnessed something they simply cannot explain. Travelers passing through often describe an unsettling feeling, as though the landscape itself is concealing something, as though those empty roads and silent hills are keeping a secret. Most of the activity clusters around the basin, but many who have studied the region believe there is one particular location that functions as the source, a 480-acre property sitting roughly 100 miles east of Salt Lake City, beautiful, expansive, and deceptively peaceful. Over time, the land picked up a name that had nothing to do with any of its owners. According to local Ute tradition, this property sits directly in the path of the Skinwalker, a dark and shape-shifting figure from Native American legend. Out of deep respect and fear, tribal members refused to set foot on the land, and so the name stuck. This became known as Skinwalker Ranch. For the latter half of the 20th century, the property was held by a family who has never been publicly identified. In 1987, they left, abruptly and without explanation, leaving the ranch completely abandoned for over 7 years. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman saw an opportunity. Along with their 2 children, they purchased the property at a surprisingly low price, believing they had found everything they were looking for. The land was stunning. Rolling green pastures, thick woodland, a creek running along the southern edge, and a high ridge to the north. For Terry, a professional cattle breeder, it felt like the perfect setup to grow his business in peace. He signed the papers with a quiet excitement. What he didn't realize was that the land he had just acquired would come close to breaking him, financially and mentally.
Of neglect. That was expected. What wasn't expected were the heavy-duty deadbolts, not just on the front and back doors, but on interior doors and every single window. At the main entrances, large metal rings had been driven into the walls with thick chains attached, clearly designed to hold powerful guard dogs in position. The previous owners had seemed eccentric, and the Shermans tried not to read too much into it. The sale contract itself contained some unusual conditions, including a clause prohibiting the new owners from digging on the property without prior consent. Strange, but easy to overlook in the excitement of the purchase. Still, somewhere in the back of Terry's mind, a quiet question lingered. What had frightened these people badly enough to turn their home into a fortress? He would soon find out. The strangeness began on the very first day. While the family was unloading a moving truck outside the house, something caught their attention across the southern pasture. It was a wolf, moving toward them in wide, sweeping arcs. As it got closer, Terry could see that it was enormous, easily 3 times the size of any wolf he had ever seen. But its behavior was disarmingly calm. It moved without aggression, slowing as it approached, its pale blue eyes scanning the group with a look of almost unsettling intelligence. It wagged its tail. Terry's father, a tall and broad-shouldered man, reached out and placed his hand on the animal's head, which reached nearly to the top of his shoulder. The wolf seemed unbothered, even friendly. The rest of the family relaxed and gathered around. Then Terry's eyes shifted to the corral about 70 feet away, where he had recently moved several of his breeding cows and calves. One curious young calf had poked its head through the metal bars to watch. Before he could react, the wolf lunged. It clamped its jaws around the calf's head and began dragging the animal through the fence. Terry grabbed an axe handle from the back of the truck and moved in fast, striking the wolf's flanks, kicking at it. But the animal didn't react at all. It held firm. He called for his son to bring the .357 Magnum from the truck. When the gun arrived, Terry fired directly into the wolf's abdomen at close range. Nothing happened. No stagger, no yelp. The wolf didn't even flinch. He fired again. Still nothing. A third shot finally caused the animal to release the calf and step back, about 10 feet. It stood there, watching him, completely unbothered. Terry fired a fourth round directly at its chest. The wolf retreated another 30 feet and simply waited. His son brought a .306 rifle from the house. Terry took careful aim and pulled the trigger. The shot connected. He was certain of it. He watched as a piece of flesh separated from the animal's body. But even that wasn't enough to bring it down. The wolf gave the calf one last look, then turned and calmly trotted back the way it had come. Terry and his son followed it for nearly half an hour, tracking it through patches of cottonwood trees and brush down toward the creek. The trail led them to a wide open mud bank, soft ground that held prints easily. The wolf's tracks were clear. And then they stopped. Mid-bank, 40 yards from the water's edge, with open ground in every direction. There was nowhere it could have gone, and yet it had vanished completely. Walking back to the house, Terry picked up the piece of flesh that had separated from the wolf during the shooting. He turned it over in his hand. It wasn't fresh. It didn't bleed. It looked and smelled like something that had been rotting in the heat for several days. He stood at the edge of the pasture and stared south for a long time. That was day one.
Over the weeks that followed, the Sherman house began to behave in ways that quietly drove Gwen to question her own sanity. She would unpack groceries, leave the kitchen, return minutes later, and find everything neatly packed back into the bags as though she had never touched them. She would set her towel and hairbrush beside the shower, lock the bathroom door, and step out to find them gone, turning up hours later in completely different parts of the house. She said nothing to Terry at first, convinced she was simply forgetting things. Then Terry came in one evening asking who had taken his post digger. He had been using it to fix a fence line, turned away briefly, and it had disappeared. The entire family searched. Nothing. Weeks later, it reappeared, hanging from a tree branch on the far side of the ranch, 70 feet off the ground. The tool weighed over 70 pounds. Around the same time, Terry noticed lights moving along his fence line in the distance. He had seen them before and assumed someone had wandered off the road to the east. This time, convinced someone was hunting on his land without permission, he moved toward them quickly. But as he got closer, the lights moved away, silently, with no engine noise. When he had closed to within 100 yards, they lifted off the ground and drifted quietly over the treetops before disappearing. There was no sound. There never was. As autumn arrived and Terry began bringing more of his prize Simmental and Angus cattle onto the ranch, the activity escalated. Winter brought heavy snowstorms, and with them came the disappearances. One night, Terry tracked one of his missing Angus cows into a dense section of woodland to the southwest, following her hoofprints deep into the snow. The spacing of the prints told him she had been running, flat out, as she entered the trees. He followed the trail into a clearing at the center of the woods. The prints stopped. The cow was gone. No signs of struggle, no blood, no animal had dragged her away. She had simply ceased to exist somewhere in the middle of an open clearing surrounded by undisturbed snow. Over the course of that winter, 4 more prize animals vanished the same way. Terry began spending his nights outside, moving through shadows around his own property, trying to catch whatever was responsible, but he never could. The lights always seemed to know he was there, retreating the moment he drew close, as though they were watching him as carefully as he was watching them. Then one night, heading back towards the house after another fruitless patrol, something moved at the edge of his vision. He dropped to the ground and looked left. A dark, solid shape hovered about 20 feet above the snow, silent, motionless, roughly the outline of a stealth aircraft, but smaller and rounder at the nose. It moved without any sound whatsoever. Coloured lights swept across the ground beneath it as though it was scanning for something. Terry watched it for around 15 minutes. Then by accident he shifted position, and his joints cracked in the silence. The lights went out instantly. The craft stopped, turned toward him. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then it rotated slowly and drifted north, disappearing into the dark. By spring, the cattle were reappearing,
but not alive. Some were found dead with no visible cause. Others had been mutilated in ways that Terry struggled to describe. Large portions of flesh and hide had been removed cleanly, with no blood left behind. The cuts showed no signs of tearing or predator activity. They looked surgical. Throughout 1995, the situation deteriorated further. The aerial lights appeared almost nightly. More objects and belongings moved around the house on their own. Dark, featureless shapes began appearing at the windows, and eventually inside the house itself, standing at the ends of beds in the middle of the night. A deep mechanical rumbling was heard emanating from beneath the ground, as though something enormous was operating underground. Neighbors heard it too. Disembodied voices speaking in unrecognizable languages drifted down from the sky. One morning, Terry found large cylindrical holes bored into his land, cleanly cut, perfectly formed, with no trace of the removed soil anywhere nearby. Hundreds of pounds of earth had been extracted in silence while the family slept. Strange animals began appearing, humanoid figures, hybrid creatures unlike anything in any field guide. An invisible presence that parted livestock as it moved through the herd, displaced water in the canal as it passed, and left behind only the evidence of its movement, and never itself. And then there were the orbs. The red ones came first, small, fast, roughly the size of a tennis ball, darting between the trees and agitating the cattle. But the ones the family feared most were the blue ones, larger, slower, and deeply unsettling to be near. Terry and Gwen were never able to explain it precisely, but proximity to a blue orb produced intense, irrational fear, a wave of dread that seemed to have no natural source. One evening, a blue orb emerged from the tree line in front of the house and began moving towards where Terry sat on the porch. His 3 hunting dogs reacted immediately, growling, then barking, then charging after it as Terry released them. For a moment, watching the dogs disappear into the trees in pursuit, he felt something close to relief. Then 3 short cries rang out from the darkness. Then silence. Terry waited until morning before entering those trees. On the ground, in the spot where his dogs had vanished, were 3 small smouldering mounds, all that remained of them. That was enough. The Sherman family had endured 2 years of relentless and escalating phenomena. They weren't sleeping, the children were failing at school. Gwen had lost her job. The family had crowded into a single room at night because they no longer felt safe in their own home. They had lost 14 head of cattle, several pets, and were approaching financial ruin. Terry had previously spoken to a local newspaper about what was happening on the ranch. The story was largely dismissed, but it traveled, eventually reaching the desk of Robert Bigelow, a wealthy entrepreneur who had been quietly funding a scientific organization dedicated to investigating exactly this kind of unexplained activity. Bigelow offered to buy the ranch. The Shermans accepted without hesitation. By July 1996, they were gone. By September, Bigelow's team, the National Institute for Discovery Science, had moved in. They would remain at Skinwalker Ranch for nearly a decade, equipped with technology, funding, and a mandate to document whatever they encountered. They would not be disappointed. Whatever had spent 2 years pushing the Sherman family to the edge of collapse was about to face something it had not encountered before. A team of investigators who were not afraid of it, who were not going to leave, and who had come specifically looking for answers. The dynamic was about to shift. Midnight signal.